I'm Gary Gupton, and this is Enterprise and Investigative Journalism. This week, Chapter 6 of our book, Investigative Journalism, deals with examining the police and the courts. I know what you're thinking. It's really exciting when you're investigating the police and the courts because you think you're going to get something like this.
Recess? I'd like an answer to the question, Judge.
The court will wait for an answer.
If Lieutenant Kendrick gave an order that Santiago wasn't to be touched, then why did he have to be transferred? Colonel, Lieutenant Kendrick ordered the code red, didn't he? Because that's what you told Lieutenant Kendrick to do.
Object!
And when it went bad, you cut these guys loose!
Your Honor!
You had
Counsel, I
Marcus
hold you
inside
in
a phony
contempt.
transfer.
Your Honor!
You doctored the logbook.
Damn it, Chapt!
You coerced the doctor.
Consider
I'm not
yourself in
asking you.
contempt.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled to.
You want answers!
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
And unfortunately, the truth is it's never quite as exciting as Hollywood makes it. In fact, investigative reporting, as you're probably starting to understand, is very difficult. It's hard work. Let's go through the flow chart. And what I want to show you today is, even though, as we've said, this flow chart is very solid, doing this is not like an exercise in math where you have a formula that goes point by point and you must follow the formula in order to get where you're wanting to go. It's very different in this very organic thing that we call investigative journalism. Again, you begin with a tip or an idea. You determine whether it's real or a rumor, and occasionally you will do that by going to getting the official response, and depending on what you hear there, that could be the end of the story. But as you know, what we're training you to do in this class is to research and get documentation to, again, vet whether or not this is real or a rumor. And then you'll do interviews with victims or experts. You'll do a survey of similars or a surveillance of the subject. Once you put all these together, you've got your summary of findings. And at that point, you're ready to present this information to get the official response and victim follow-up interviews. At that point now, you've got an investigative story. But let me again point out to you, even though this is solid, it's not a formula like you'd have in your algebra class. In Gaines, page 132, he talks about corrupt police and crime statistics. And let me give you a quote from the book. It says, "The trick of doctoring local crime statistics is achieved by understating unsolved crimes and overstating those that have been solved. Investigations from within most police departments are thin on documents. An investigator needs guidance from sources within the department to know where to find any telling documents, and much rests on the testimony of witnesses." And that's certainly the case in an investigative story that was generated by ABC 7 News out of New York. Again, their flow chart would have looked a little bit differently, but includes some of the same elements that you and I talk about every week. The story, as you will see, starts with an inside source, and then the reporter researches and gathers his documents. He gets victim interviews, followed by, again, an official response. As he starts reporting the story, he gets an official response, goes back and gets surveillance of the subject through secretive recordings, audio recordings, which you're about to hear. And then, interestingly, the inside source then becomes one of the victims of this investigative story, and then they go back again and conclude with official response and follow-up interviews for the investigative story that we now present from ABC 7 News.
Joe and Sandra, we've spent weeks talking to this sergeant and examining hours of audio tape and numerous crime reports he gave to us. Proof, he says, that the Rockaway precinct, where he was a supervisor, has been downgrading felonies to make crime look low and top brass look good. Sergeant Robert Borelli says the NYPD has left him with no choice but to go public after months of ignoring his allegations of routine misclassification of crimes at the 100th Precinct in Queens. He says the pressure there to manipulate crime reports has become unbearable.
I just couldn't take it anymore. Came a point that it just finally broke, and I'm like, this has got to come to a stop.
So last May, Sergeant Borelli started handing over dozens of crime reports to the NYPD's Quality Assurance Division, whose job it is to ensure the accuracy of crime stats. The reports, he claims, amounted to smoking gun evidence of intentional routine downgrading of crimes.
They're constantly changing the classification to downgrade crime so it's not tracked. It goes under the radar according to the FBI crime stats.
So in other words, trying to bury the serious crimes.
That's correct.
For example, This incident from last August, in which an angry customer fired 4 shots at a cab driver, a clear case of felony assault.
I was the supervisor on the scene. I made the determination of what we had. I appropriately charged the proper crime, the attempted assault 1, and it was later on changed, I believe, the following morning. Someone lined it out and changed it to reckless endangerment.
In another case, the sergeant claims a felony burglary was downgraded to criminal mischief after an officer coached the victim to exclude from the crime report that her ex-boyfriend stole 2 flat-screen TVs from her apartment. Sergeant Borelli was recording when he called the victim to ask why the report never mentions the stolen TVs and the ex-boyfriend's unlawful entry.
Did he have permission to be there?
No,
Okay, how come he had access to the keys, though?
because he took them from me.
Did he also take 2 flat-screen TVs out of your apartment?
Yes.
Okay, how come that wasn't mentioned in the domestic incident report or the complaint report?
I did tell them that.
I know, but did you write that in the domestic incident report or no?
You know what? I didn't write every single detail because they just said to make it short and sweet. You know, write down that he came into your home, smashed your stuff, and that was it. So I wrote down what they had told me to.
Their intent was to hide the burglary, in other words, disguise it by leaving the flat screens out, by saying that the individual had permission and authority to be in the apartment when he did not.
Sergeant Borelli says quality assurance confirmed in a secret taped conversation that some of the reports he gave to them had indeed been misclassified.
Now you think what I'm saying is, kind of being corroborated? And we have a couple of misclasses based on obviously based on some of your calls. We have a misclass on criminal miss, and we have a misclass on domestic. So we have some misclasses.
In a statement, the NYPD tells us Sergeant Borelli's allegations of widespread downgrading have been unsubstantiated by a quality assurance audit at the 100th Precinct. They found out of 925 audited crime reports, just 17 had been misclassified. But of the reports Borelli fed to quality assurance on his own, 4 of them were determined to be misclassified. Sergeant Borelli is no longer able to feed misclassified reports to quality assurance. Suddenly, and without explanation, he was recently transferred out of the precinct where he had been a supervisor for nearly a decade to the midnight shift at the Bronx courthouse.
The department needed to isolate me, they needed to contain me, so they transferred me out to remove me from having access to the complaint reports that I was giving to quality assurance on a pretty much week-to-week basis.
Sergeant Borelli has also been hit with discipline charges for an argument with an officer. The NYPD says the number of misclassifications found in their audit at the 100th Precinct was around 2%, the average at precincts citywide.
I got to give credit to that reporter. A very balanced report. They presented both sides, the facts, some of which contradicted the witness testimony, and then they allowed the viewer to draw their own conclusions. So your assignment this week, read Chapter 6 of Investigative Journalism, Examining the Police and the Courts. Your assignment this week is Roll Call on Death Row, and then we will see you back here next week on Enterprise and Investigative Journalism.